The world knew Charlie Chaplin as the Little Tramp, the man who made millions laugh, the genius who transformed silence into poetry on the silver screen. But behind the painted smile and the shuffling walk lived a man haunted by a secret so devastating, so deeply buried, that even his own children never knew it existed. A secret that would remain locked away for decades. A secret about a tiny life that flickered and died in just 3 days. It was 1919. Charlie Chaplin stood at the absolute pinnacle of human fame. His name blazed across theater marquees from New York to Paris, from London to Tokyo. He was the most recognized face on planet Earth, more famous than presidents, more beloved than kings. Children imitated his walk. Adults quoted his gestures. His films packed theaters until people stood in aisles just to catch a glimpse of the Little Tramp. He had conquered the world without speaking a single word. But fame, as Chaplin would learn, couldn't prepare him for what was coming. Nothing could prepare him for the devastation that would arrive on a summer day in July. His first wife, Mildred Harris, was pregnant. She was just 16 years old when they married in October 1918, a child bride swept into the whirlwind orbit of Hollywood's brightest star. Their marriage was turbulent from the beginning, built on shifting sand and questionable foundations. Some whispered that Chaplin married her only because he believed she was pregnant, though that first pregnancy turned out to be false. Their relationship was a storm of arguments, reconciliations, misunderstandings, and resentments. But when Mildred became legitimately pregnant in early 1919, something shifted in Chaplin's heart. This was going to be his child. His son or daughter. A piece of himself that would continue beyond the flickering images on a movie screen. The months of pregnancy passed with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Chaplin threw himself into his work as he always did when emotions became too complex to handle. He filmed. He directed. He performed. The cameras rolled and the Little Tramp danced across sets while inside, Charlie Chaplin prepared himself for fatherhood. He had known such profound suffering in his own childhood. His mother had been committed to mental asylums. His father had died of alcoholism. He had lived in workhouses, scrounged for food, experienced poverty so crushing that it marked his soul forever. Perhaps, he thought, this child would be his redemption. This child would know the security, the love, the stability that he had been denied. July 7, 1919. Mildred went into labor. In those days, childbirth was still a dangerous, mysterious process. Medical knowledge was primitive compared to what would come later. Anesthesia was crude. Interventions were limited. When complications arose, doctors could do little but watch and hope. Mildred labored for hours and Charlie waited. He waited the way expectant fathers have always waited, pacing, imagining, wondering whether he would have a son or daughter, whether the child would have his eyes or Mildred's smile, whether this tiny person would grow up to be an artist or a scientist or something entirely unexpected. And then the baby arrived. Norman Spencer Chaplin. A boy. Charlie's first son. But the joy that should have flooded that delivery room never came. Instead, there was a terrible, suffocating silence. The doctors knew immediately. The nurses exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. The infant was severely malformed. His little body bore defects so serious that survival seemed impossible. This was 1919, remember? Medical science stood helpless before such conditions. There were no surgeries to correct what nature had done. No interventions to save what was slipping away. The doctors could only make the baby comfortable and wait for the inevitable. Charlie held his son for the first time. This fragile, struggling life. This tiny person who had his blood, his DNA, his genetic legacy. Norman's eyes were closed. His breathing was labored, each breath a mountain to climb. His little chest rose and fell with excruciating slowness. Charlie looked down at this child who would never call him father, never run to greet him, never grow up to make his own mark on the world. And something inside Charlie Chaplin broke in a way that would never fully heal. For 3 days, Norman Spencer Chaplin clung to life. 72 hours that must have felt like 72 years. Charlie and Mildred took turns holding their dying son. They watched him fight for every breath. Every tiny gasp was a battle. Every heartbeat was a miracle and a tragedy combined. The doctors offered morphine to ease any pain the infant might be experiencing. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones about making the baby comfortable, about the limited time remaining, about preparing for the worst. But how do you prepare for the worst when the worst is watching your firstborn child die in your arms? Charlie, the man who had made the entire world laugh, sat in that hospital room and felt laughter become impossible. He was only 30 years old, but in those 3 days he aged decades. He had known poverty. He had known hunger. He had known the humiliation of the workhouse and the agony of watching his mother descend into madness. But this was different. This was watching innocence itself struggle and fail. This was seeing the future die before it could even begin. Norman never opened his eyes to see his father's face. He never felt sunlight on his skin. He never heard music or tasted milk or experienced a single moment of joy. His entire existence was struggle and pain and the slow surrender to death. On July 10, 1919, just 3 days after his birth, Norman Spencer Chaplin died. The struggling stopped. The labored breathing ceased. The tiny heartbeat fell silent. And Charlie Chaplin experienced a grief so profound that it had no words. He held his dead son and felt the warmth slowly leave that little body. He looked at Mildred's tear-stained face and saw his own anguish reflected back. They had created this life together, this brief flicker of existence. And now it was gone, snuffed out before it could truly begin. The funeral was small, private, hidden from the ravenous press that usually documented Chaplin's every move. They buried Norman in Southern California, under a stone marker that read simply, "The Little Mouse." Not Norman Spencer Chaplin. Not the son of the world's most famous entertainer. Just, the little mouse. A tiny creature who had scurried briefly through the world and disappeared. Charlie stood at that graveside and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would never speak of this again. Never. This grief was too raw, too devastating, too personal to share with a world that saw him as public property. Norman would become a secret, buried as completely as that small body in the California soil. And so began decades of silence. Chaplin returned to work because work was his salvation, his escape, his only defense against overwhelming emotion. But he was changed. Everyone around him noticed. There was a darkness now, a shadow behind the famous eyes. 4 months later, in April 1920, his marriage to Mildred ended in divorce. They were, as he would later write, irreconcilably mismated. But the truth was more complex. How do you stay married to someone who reminds you every day of your greatest loss? How do you look at the woman who bore your dead child without seeing that tiny coffin, that small grave marker, those 3 terrible days? Chaplin channeled his grief into his art, as great artists always do. His next major film would be The Kid, a story about the little tramp finding and raising an abandoned child. It wasn't subtle. The film dripped with the emotions Chaplin couldn't express any other way. He poured his longing for fatherhood, his grief over Norman, his own traumatic childhood into every frame. The scene where the tramp fights to keep the orphan authorities from taking the child away is heartbreaking because it came from a real, ragged wound in Chaplin's soul. He was directing his own anguish, performing his own tragedy, telling the world about his pain without ever admitting the source. The Kid became one of his greatest triumphs. Audiences wept. Critics raved. The film touched something universal about love and loss and the fierce bond between parent and child. But nobody knew. Nobody understood that they were watching one man's grief transformed into art. Charlie Chaplin smiled for the cameras, accepted the praise, counted the box office receipts. And never, ever mentioned the real child he had lost. Years passed. Chaplin married again. In 1924, he secretly married 16-year-old Lita Gray in Mexico. She had appeared in his films as a child, and their relationship began when she was still a teenager. The marriage was another disaster, but it produced 2 sons who survived. Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. was born on May 5, 1925. Sidney Earl Chaplin arrived on March 30, 1926. Charlie held these boys and felt joy mixed with the phantom pain of that earlier loss. These children thrived. They grew. They opened their eyes and saw their father's face. They learned to walk and talk and laugh. Everything Norman never got to do. Did Charlie look at them and think of their older brother? Did he wonder what Norman might have become? Did he feel guilt that these children lived while his firstborn had died? He never said. The silence held. The marriage to Lita ended catastrophically in 1927, with a divorce so scandalous and expensive that it nearly destroyed Chaplin's reputation. But more children followed with other women. In 1943, Paulette Goddard came and went from his life. Then came the Joan Barry paternity scandal, a nightmare of courtrooms and blood tests and accusations. Through it all, Chaplin never mentioned Norman. Not once. Not even as his life became an open book, dissected by lawyers and journalists and scandal sheets. Finally, in 1943, at age 54, Charlie Chaplin married 18-year-old Una O'Neill, daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. This marriage, his 4th, would last until his death. And with Una he found something like peace. They had 8 children together. Geraldine was born in 1944. Michael in 1946. Josephine in 1949, Victoria in 1951, Eugene in 1953, Jane in 1957, Annette in 1959, Christopher in 1962. 8 healthy, thriving children who filled Chaplin's later years with the family he had always craved. He was an attentive father to them, involved and loving in ways that his earlier abandonment and chaos had prevented with his older children. But he never told them about Norman. Not one word. Geraldine grew up to become a famous actress. Michael became a successful actor. The other children pursued various paths, some in entertainment, others in private life. They knew they had older half-siblings from their father's previous marriages. They knew Charles Jr. and Sidney. They knew about their father's complicated romantic history. But they didn't know about the brother who had lived for 3 days in 1919. That remained locked away, a secret their father guarded with absolute determination. Think about what that means. Charlie Chaplin eventually had 11 children who survived infancy. 11 sons and daughters who called him father, who grew up in his shadow, who inherited his legacy. And not one of them knew about Norman. Not during Chaplin's lifetime. The secret was so complete that even his autobiography, published in 1964, made only the briefest mention of Norman's existence and death. A few sentences. Nothing more. No emotion. No reflection. No admission of the devastation that had shaped so much of his art and life. Why such absolute silence? Why bury this tragedy so completely? Some might say it was the times. In 1919, infant mortality was common. Families lost children and were expected to move on, to have more babies, to not dwell on death. Public grieving, especially for men, was considered weakness. Chaplin had been raised in Victorian England where emotion was controlled, contained, hidden behind propriety and stiff upper lips. Perhaps he was simply following the unspoken rules of his generation. But there's more to it than that. Charlie Chaplin had endured unimaginable suffering as a child. His mother's mental illness had destroyed their family. His father's alcoholism had left him essentially orphaned. He had been shuttled between workhouses and institutions, places where children were more inventory than individuals. He had learned early that showing vulnerability meant inviting more pain. So he built walls around his heart, thick walls that even fame and fortune couldn't breach. Norman's death crashed through those walls briefly, painfully. And Chaplin's response was to rebuild them higher and stronger than before. There's also the question of control. Chaplin controlled everything in his films. He directed, wrote, starred, composed the music, edited the footage. Total control. But he couldn't control Norman's malformed body. He couldn't control those 3 days of suffering. He couldn't control death. So he did the only thing he could control, the narrative. By refusing to speak of Norman, by burying that story as completely as he had buried his son, Chaplin maintained control over his public image. The world would know Charlie Chaplin the genius, the artist, the comedian. They wouldn't know Charlie Chaplin the grieving father. He wouldn't allow it. And perhaps there was an element of protection in the silence too. Chaplin knew what the press could do with personal tragedy. He had seen how his divorces became public circuses, how every detail of his romantic life got picked apart by gossip columnists and scandal sheets. If he had spoken openly about Norman, his dead son would have become public property. Journalists would have written maudlin articles. Photographers would have tried to get pictures of the grave. Fans would have sent sympathy cards and flowers and well-meaning but intrusive condolences. Norman would have been reduced to a talking point, a footnote in the Charlie Chaplin story. By keeping silent, Chaplin kept Norman sacred. Private. Is alone. But silence has cost. Charles Jr., Chaplin's oldest surviving son, grew up troubled and struggling. He wrote a biography of his father in 1960, trying to understand the complicated, distant man who had given him life but so little else. Charles Jr. never knew he'd had an older brother. How might that knowledge have changed his understanding of his father? How might it have helped him comprehend the distance, the emotional unavailability, the sense that Charlie Chaplin was always holding something back? Charles Jr. died at 42 of a pulmonary embolism, his relationship with his father forever complicated by things unsaid and secrets kept. Sidney Earle, the other son from the Lita Gray marriage, fared better. He won a Tony Award for his Broadway performance and acted opposite Barbra Streisand. He lived to 82. But he too never knew about Norman during his father's lifetime. None of the children from the Una O'Neill marriage knew. They grew up in Switzerland, where Chaplin had moved after being essentially exiled from the United States during the Red Scare of the 1950s. They had a more stable childhood than their older half-siblings, with a devoted mother and a father who had finally found some measure of peace. But the secret remained. Imagine being one of those children and discovering, perhaps years after your father's death, that you had a brother nobody ever mentioned. A brother whose entire life lasted 72 hours. A brother whose grave had been visited by your father in secret, whose memory had shaped your father's greatest works, whose existence had been deliberately hidden for decades. How would that feel? Would it explain certain things about your father's character, his darkness, his distance? Would it make his artistic obsession with childhood and loss suddenly make sense? Or would it feel like a betrayal, one more secret in a life full of them? The grave marker reading "The Little Mouse" sits in a cemetery in Southern California to this day. It's become a pilgrimage site for Chaplin fans who have learned the story. They leave flowers. They take photographs. They pay respects to a child who never had a chance at life. But for decades, that grave was visited only by Charlie and perhaps Mildred, the two people who had created and lost Norman. They stood at that small plot of earth and remembered 3 days that had changed everything. Mildred Harris moved on with her life after the divorce. She continued acting through the 1920s and into the early 1930s. She remarried twice. But she too rarely spoke of Norman. The loss was hers to carry just as it was Charlie's. In a 1940 interview, she made a brief mention of having lost a baby years earlier, but provided no details. She died in 1944 at age 42 from pneumonia. She took her memories of those 3 days to her grave, buried not far from the son she had held so briefly. Charlie Chaplin lived much longer. He survived scandal and exile. He returned to Hollywood in 1972 to accept an honorary Academy Award, receiving a 12-minute standing ovation from an industry that had turned its back on him 20 years earlier. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 1975. He continued to work on film projects and musical compositions until the very end. He died on Christmas Day 1977, at his home in Switzerland. He was 88 years old. He had lived a life of extraordinary achievement and profound complexity. And still he had never truly spoken about Norman. Only after his death did the full story begin to emerge. Biographers researched. Records were examined. The grave with its little mouse marker was discovered and documented. Chaplin's children learned about the brother they never knew. The secret finally came out, not because Charlie chose to reveal it, but because death had finally silenced the man who had controlled his narrative so completely for so long. What does it mean to grieve in silence for nearly 60 years? What does it do to a person to carry such loss without ever fully expressing it? Chaplin poured his emotions into his films, yes. The Kid was clearly influenced by Norman's death and Chaplin's own childhood traumas. Later films like Limelight, which dealt with aging and mortality and the passage of time, carried echoes of losses both public and private. But that's not the same as speaking honestly about grief. That's not the same as telling your children, you had a brother. He died when he was 3 days old. I think about him sometimes. I miss what might have been. Consider what Norman's siblings might have learned from knowing about him. They would have understood that life is fragile, that not every story has a happy ending, that even the most famous father in the world couldn't protect his child from tragedy. They would have seen their father's humanity more clearly, his vulnerability, his capacity for deep feeling beneath the famous facade. They might have felt more connected to him, knowing he had suffered losses they could comprehend. Instead, they grew up with a father who was brilliant but distant, loving but complicated, there but somehow always apart. The psychological cost of such profound silence is incalculable. Grief unexpressed doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes anxiety, depression, distance, workaholism. It seeps into relationships and art and decision-making. Charlie Chaplin's pattern of marrying very young women, for instance, has been analyzed from many angles. Was he seeking to recapture lost youth? Was it about power and control? Was it problematic behavior shaped by his era's different standards? Perhaps. But it might also have been about trying to create the stable family he never had, trying to do fatherhood right after failing his firstborn so completely. Not that he had actually failed Norman, of course. The baby's malformations were nobody's fault. But grief isn't logical. Survivor's guilt isn't rational. Perhaps Chaplin carried some irrational sense that he should have been able to save his son, and spent the rest of his life trying to make up for that impossible failure. The silence also affected how the world understood Chaplin. For decades he was seen as a genius but also as someone emotionally stunted, unable to maintain relationships, distant from his older children, forever chasing youth through inappropriate marriages. Critics psychoanalyzed him. Biographers speculated. Everyone had theories about what made Charlie Chaplin the way he was. They pointed to his traumatic childhood, his mother's madness, his father's alcoholism, the workhouses and poverty. All of that was true and relevant. But they missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. They didn't know about Norman. They didn't know about 3 days in July 1919 that had broken something inside Charlie Chaplin that never fully healed. Art created from grief has a particular quality. It resonates at frequencies that purely intellectual work cannot achieve. When you watch The Kid, knowing that Chaplin had recently lost his infant son, every frame gains new meaning. The scene where the tramp discovers the abandoned baby isn't just comedy and pathos. It's wish fulfillment. It's Chaplin imagining what might have been if Norman had lived, if Chaplin had gotten to raise him, to care for him, to be the father he desperately wanted to be. The scene where authorities try to take the child away and the tramp fights desperately to keep him is Chaplin battling death itself, fighting the doctors who couldn't save Norman, raging against the injustice of losing a child who never had a chance. But audiences in 1921 didn't know that. They saw a brilliant film about love and loss and redemption. They cried at the beautiful story. They had no idea they were watching a man work through his trauma in the only way he knew how. That's the power and the tragedy of Chaplin's silence. His greatest work was born from his deepest pain, but nobody knew. They appreciated the art without understanding its source. They loved the artist without knowing his heart. As the years passed and Chaplin's later children were born and grew up, did he ever come close to telling them? Did he ever sit with Geraldine or Michael or one of the others and feel the words rising in his throat? You had a brother. His name was Norman. He only lived 3 days, but I think about him still. Did those words almost escape, only to be swallowed back down by habit and fear and the weight of decades of silence? Or had the secret become so completely buried that it no longer even occurred to him to share it? Had Norman become so thoroughly locked away that even Chaplin himself rarely accessed those memories? We'll never know. That's the nature of secrets. They leave gaps in the historical record that can never be fully filled. We have the facts. Norman Spencer Chaplin, born July 7, 1919, died July 10, 1919, buried under a stone marked The Little Mouse. We have the context. Chaplin's first marriage, ending in divorce. We have the aftermath, The Kid, and the other films that carried echoes of loss. But we don't have Chaplin's interior life during those 3 days and the decades that followed. We don't have his private thoughts, his dreams about Norman, his imagined conversations with the son who never spoke. All of that died with him. What we do have is the lesson. The lesson about grief and secrets, about the cost of silence, about the human need to acknowledge loss rather than bury it. Modern psychology tells us that unexpressed grief causes harm. That talking about loss is healthy. That children benefit from knowing their family's full history, including the painful parts. But Charlie Chaplin lived in a different era with different rules. He did the best he could with the emotional tools he had available. And if that meant decades of silence, if that meant 11 children who never knew about their brother, if that meant carrying that burden alone until death finally released him from it, well, perhaps that was the only way he could survive the unsurvivable. Think about The Little Tramp, Chaplin's most famous creation. The character walks through a cruel world with dignity and optimism despite constant setbacks. He gets knocked down and gets back up. He faces poverty, rejection, heartbreak with a resilient spirit that never quite breaks. Is that just comedy? Or is it Charlie Chaplin showing us how he survived his own life? The workhouses, the mental asylums, the dead father, the lost child, the scandals and divorces and exile. He got knocked down again and again, and every time he got back up. He put on the costume, painted the smile, shuffled that iconic walk, and made people laugh. Even when his own heart was breaking. Especially when his own heart was breaking. Norman Spencer Chaplin existed for 72 hours in July 1919. He never saw his father perform. He never heard his father's voice. He never experienced a single moment of the joy and laughter that Charlie Chaplin brought to millions. His entire existence was suffering and struggle and slow death. But his impact reverberated through the decades. He influenced one of cinema's greatest films. He shaped his father's emotional landscape in ways both obvious and subtle. He became the secret at the heart of the Chaplin family, the missing piece that explained so much once it was finally discovered. A life that lasted 3 days but mattered for 88 years and beyond. To this day, Chaplin's surviving descendants carry the knowledge of Norman differently than they carry knowledge of other family members. He's not a relative they remember or miss in the conventional sense. He's more like a ghost, a might have been, a pathway not taken. If Norman had survived, would Charlie have stayed married to Mildred? Would there have been other children from that marriage instead of the complicated web of half-siblings from multiple mothers? Would Chaplin's art have taken different directions if he'd had a thriving son instead of a dead one? Would he have been a different father to his later children if his firstborn hadn't died in his arms? These are unanswerable questions, but they're worth asking because they illuminate how one brief life and one long silence shaped everything that followed. History is full of such moments. Sliding door instances where everything changes based on a single event. If Norman had been born healthy, the entire trajectory of Charlie Chaplin's personal life might have been different. But he wasn't. And so we have the history we have, not the history that might have been. The grave marker says, "The little mouse." It's such a tender phrase, so full of affection and heartbreak. A little mouse scurries quietly through the world, noticed by few, gone in a moment. Charlie Chaplin, who could have afforded the most elaborate monument, who could have emblazoned his son's grave with his famous name, chose instead this simple, loving phrase. The little mouse. It suggests fragility and tenderness. It suggests something small and precious that needed protection but couldn't be saved. It suggests a father who loved his son even though, or perhaps especially because, that son never had a chance to become anything but potential and loss. Visitors to the grave today sometimes leave toys. Little stuffed mice, appropriately enough. Flowers. Notes expressing sympathy for a loss that happened over a century ago. It's a strange phenomenon when you think about it. People mourning a child they never knew, whose parents are long dead, whose brief existence would be completely forgotten if not for his father's fame. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Norman's story resonates because it's universal. Every parent who has lost a child understands that grief transcends time and circumstance. Every person who has carried a secret knows the weight of things unsaid. Every human being who has loved and lost recognizes the ache in Charlie Chaplin's silence. As I bring this story to a close, I want you to understand what we're really talking about here. This isn't just about a famous man and a dead baby. This is about how we handle unbearable pain. This is about the stories families tell and the stories they don't tell. This is about the secrets that shape us without our even knowing they exist. Charlie Chaplin's 11 surviving children grew up not knowing about Norman, and that absence of knowledge was itself a presence in their lives. They sensed something in their father, something sad and distant and forever out of reach. They just didn't know what. And by the time they learned the truth, it was too late to ask him about it, too late to hear his side of the story in his own words. That's the real tragedy here, isn't it? Not just Norman's death, though that was tragic enough, but the compounded tragedy of silence. The lost opportunity for connection. The wall between father and children built from unspoken grief. Charlie Chaplin gave the world so much. Laughter. Art. Films that still move audiences a century later. But he couldn't give his own children the truth about their brother. He couldn't let them know him fully, completely, vulnerably. And so they loved the legend but never quite knew the man. On Christmas Day 1977, when Charlie Chaplin took his last breath in Switzerland, surrounded by family, did he think of Norman in those final moments? Did that tiny face flash through his mind one last time? Did he imagine finally telling his son he was sorry for not saving him, sorry for burying his memory along with his body, sorry for making him a secret rather than a celebration? Did Charlie hope to meet Norman again somewhere beyond death, to hold him without the pain this time, to see him grown into the person he never got to become? We'll never know. Those final thoughts died with him, as private and guarded as everything else. What we're left with is the story. The documented facts and the inevitable speculation. Norman Spencer Chaplin, born July 7, 1919, died July 10, 1919. The little mouse. Charlie Chaplin's first child and first great loss. The secret that 11 siblings never knew. The grief that shaped a genius. The silence that lasted a lifetime. And now, more than a century later, we finally speak his name. We finally acknowledge his brief existence. We finally give him the recognition his father never could. Norman Spencer Chaplin. He was here. He mattered. His 3 days changed everything. And he will not be forgotten again.